Thank you very much. First of all, to Heather Conley and to the GMF for hosting us for this timely conversation. To Stefan Wintels and KFW, thank you for literally hosting us for this conversation. Minister Lindner, we know how many consequential conversations are on your plate today, so thankful to be with you. And to all of you for joining us at such an important time. The moment where we're gathering, 50 years after the creation of the German Marshall Fund, 75 years after the Marshall Plan, is, of course, very timely for very current reasons, which I'll mention in a moment. But I would also say because a 75th anniversary is always among the most important landmarks that you can note. And I know that might be considered a strange opinion. Some might think you only do 75 out of mathematical tidiness. But I would argue, especially in the context of events that contribute decisively to the shaping of a world order, that 75 years on is a uniquely important phase to think about their impact, because it marks the stage at which those events are decisively and irreversibly passing out of living memory. I would be considered a young man, at least as American political figures go. But I'm old enough to feel connected to the events of World War II and its immediate aftermath in personal terms. My parents were born in that period. I know how those events shaped the communities and the institutions in which I have lived and worked. My children, on the other hand, will be students still when we begin to mark that period in terms of 100-year anniversaries. For them, the entirety of the Cold War will be strictly a matter of history and not one of memory. So that means that we who are living at this hinge point between history and memory have a special responsibility to mark and to reaffirm the lessons of that period. And then, of course, you have the more immediate reasons. As fate would have it, 2022 is not just some random year that falls 75 years after 1947 and 50 after 1972. The brutal, unprovoked Russian invasion of Ukraine and the necessities of the united international response to it make this year one of profound and swift and tectonic change. Sweden and Finland are seeking admission to NATO. Germany, already such a leader in diplomatic and economic terms, is taking major new steps in security and energy policy. These and other changes are underway in ways that shake assumptions, agreements, frameworks, and institutions that have been relatively stable and predictable since the end of the Cold War, or even since its beginning. And I recognize with all humility that as important as these developments are to us in the US, they are still more immediate and more central here in Europe. I don't come with many easy answers, but I wanted to contribute to the conversation by reflecting on some of the affinities between today and that period 75 years ago, and some of the most important differences. And above all, I want to speak to how these conditions reinforce the importance of our commitment to the relationships and the values that connect us. Maybe the most important thing we have in common with our forebears 75 years ago is a consciousness that a future for liberal democracy is not guaranteed. This fact would have been blindingly obvious for those picking up the pieces after the Second World War. In this century, by contrast, it has come to many as a rude and recent awakening. But the durability of democratic processes, norms, rules, and institutions that was an article of faith, certainly for my generation growing up, is, I think, very much now in question. And of course, this touches the legacy of the Marshall Plan and the daily work of a U.S. Transportation Secretary in many ways, because the question has also been called of whether liberal democracies are in fact the most effective at delivering in concrete and material terms. Marshall, of course, understood the dynamics between democracy and delivery. He understood that material well-being was necessary for liberal democracies to thrive in the first place. The line of his speech that is so often quoted is, "Our policy is directed not against any country or doctrine, but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos." But I think it's the very next sentence that might resonate with us right now, when he defined the purpose of his plan as, quote, "the revival of a working economy in the world so as to permit the emergence of political and social conditions in which free institutions can exist." And that insight that the existence of free institutions depends on certain economic, political, and social conditions is, I think, as relevant in our time as in his. The Marshall Plan delivered much-needed infrastructure across international boundaries, fortifying the development of liberal democratic institutions and polities in Europe. And it helped to establish a virtuous cycle between the economic security of free nations and their overall political stability through their capacity to deliver. In the United States in recent years, we've been contending with the fact that decades of disinvestment turned that virtuous cycle into a vicious one, with our political institutions sometimes lacking the resources to deliver well, therefore losing their legitimacy, eroding trust, giving credence to those who would undermine those institutions, further diminishing their capacity to deliver, and so on. But today, we are breaking that cycle with the generational investment in our infrastructure, knowing that the stakes include not just the comfort and convenience of our transportation systems, but perhaps the credibility of our system of government itself. President Biden has often spoken to the need to demonstrate through wise investment the capacity of a democratic government like our own to deliver. In the context of U.S. competition with China, he described our moment as, quote, a battle between the utility of democracies in the 21st century and autocracies. And the relationship between values and results has always mattered. In the 1930s, another season when democracy was in doubt, and when it had become fashionable in some circles in Washington to point approvingly to the rise of dictators. Some would say, by way of praise for fascism, that Mussolini makes the trains run on time. This turns out not to be particularly true, by the way, but I won't digress. But think how revealing it is that this famous example of an excuse made for autocrats comes on the basis of their supposed prowess in providing transportation. So we understand that delivering services and public goods effectively is both necessary for free institutions, and it's one of the main reasons it's so important to preserve them. That's why the Biden-Harris administration is investing to the largest degree since the Eisenhower presidency in our country's roads and bridges, trains and transit, ports and airports, as well as major investments in internet access for all, water upgrades, and other vital infrastructure. Knowing that the resulting features of high-quality infrastructure can stand not just as pillars of transportation, but as cathedrals of democracy. So I'm dwelling on this example because it's closest to my own work, but of course it's just one reflection of the rhymes between the concerns before us today and those that were central to policymakers in the 1940s. War in Europe, dramatic changes in the character of industrial production, new and destabilizing community technologies for mass communication, mutual suspicion between liberal democracies like ours on one hand and autocratic regimes on the other, leading to new contours of great power competition. All of these things connect us, of course, very closely to that period. But then there are some very important differences. Futurist depictions of the era in which we now live, whether they were fashioned in the 1940s or the 70s, would certainly say a lot about the future of transportation, automation, communication. But few, if any of them, anticipated things like how dramatically the climate would change and threaten lives and livelihoods on Earth. And even fewer, if any at all, imagined how the function of something as familiar as the printed word, or at least the typed word, would go through such changes in the era of social media. With our most influential politicians and journalists and citizens deeply absorbed in a gamified socio-political discourse in which everyone is a reporter and no one is an editor. And if anyone could have pictured the full extent of our universal communication, the ability to instantly and freely communicate with one person or millions by writing a sentence on a pocket supercomputer doubling as a telephone, including instant and relatively workable machine translation, surely they would have supposed this would only help with the development of mutual understanding. Wouldn't it add up to a universal and credible shared picture of the realities around us? But of course, something very different happened. We have access to more information than ever, and yet less access than before to a shared reality. In autocratic countries, censorship and propaganda serve to distort citizens' perceptions of reality. But in the West, certainly in the United States, we have our own disturbing fragmentation of reality for very different reasons. For us, the problem is less one of censorship certainly not one of censorship by overzealous state editors. It's the fact that in digital media, the editorial function itself, the function of deciding which commentary to feature and put forward and promote, has been replaced by an algorithmic function that presents us with the items that our brains are predicted to absorb with the most energy, regardless of how true they are, let alone how constructive. And so a technology with the theoretical possibility of uniting people across boundaries instead seems to be making even next-door neighbors less likely to participate in the same world. Humanity is very new at contending with this, with no easy answers, but some insights emerging. And parenthetically, I would offer the possibility that Germany, with its experience of political, economic, social, and media partition, followed by unification, may well have some special insights that a place like GMF may be uniquely positioned to explore. So in contending with the challenges of our time, we have important and powerful tools. Some have always been helpful, like robust investment in public infrastructure and spaces where we inhabit the same offline 3D realities. Use of travel to bring people together. But other tools that were not available to us 75 years ago, and those tools, those institutions, those frameworks are a major advantage in rising to the challenges of today. Yes, those challenges have a different face, but they have a level of urgency that I think very much unites us with our forebears. Thanks to the efforts of the last 7 or 8 decades, we have powerful instruments of cooperation among those who share the same values, the same fundamental commitments, including our bilateral alliances, instruments of cooperation like the European Union and NATO, and most certainly civil society institutions like the German Marshall Fund itself. The more is changing in this moment, the more our commitments to liberal democracy and collective security are under threat, the more important it will be to shore up, and yes, where necessary, adapt any and all organizations that reflect those shared commitments and values. None of us know exactly what lies on the other side of this Zeitenwende, but all of us should recognize that the only way for it to lead to a good place is for us to find our way there together. Thank you again for the chance to join.
Well, thank you very much. That was a wonderful way to open up a conversation, and we're very grateful, Secretary, for your remarks, and of course, Minister Lindner. We did this very purposely, German-American. We wanted to mix this up here. And so I was going to throw out the first question. I'll call this the icebreaker question. And Stefan, you sort of answered it in your opening remarks, but Tomas, I'm going to start with you and then I'll work my way down. When you think of the Marshall Plan, what are 3 words that come to your mind? Very quickly, don't think too hard.
Okay.
Fast, rapid, 3 words.
I think it was a brilliant plan.
Brilliant.
I think it set out hope for a whole continent, and it's the foundation of partnership and friendship.
That's fantastic.
Brilliant, hope, friendship.
I love it. Brilliant hope, friendship. Mr. Secretary, you have to use that microphone. 3 words that just rapidly come to your mind. It was already sort of in your remarks. But
Infrastructure, of course.
Infrastructure. Yes.
Values and recovery.
Fabulous. Stefan?
I had more time than my fellows to think about. So a vision, execution, and values as well.
Fantastic. These are action verbs. These are powerful words, and I think it speaks to the power of the Marshall Plan. So what I thought I'd do is sort of take us through 3 concentric circles very briefly. And the first, I do want to focus a little bit on thinking about a Marshall Plan for Ukraine. And the one thing that I think is really interesting, President Zelensky and the Ukrainian government have already signaled that they want support and reconstruction on a cities and a region level. President Zelensky has suggested that different Ukrainian regions and cities be adopted and have its support coming through the local support. So I'm going to reverse order. Stefan, I'm going to start with you. From a development bank perspective, how would supporting a very regional city, a more local-driven development, how would you think the development banks would support that? And Mr. Secretary, I'm going to have you put your former Mayor Pete hat on of South Bend. How would you feel as a mayor? How would you be positioned and ready to support that assistance? And I'll have it from the parliamentarian perspective. How do you do oversight and make sure that very valuable taxpayer dollars are stewarded very wisely when we know Ukraine has been struggling for decades with corruption? So different twists on a Marshall Plan for Ukraine.
Much time do we have?
You've got, this is rapid fire, so
very
we're
rapid
not too long.
So I keep myself very brief, but leaving aside the immediate consequences which we need to fix of the war, rebuilding, etc. I think this is the must which we need to do. I think we should look through this war and ask ourselves the questions: what does the Ukraine 2.0 need to become as quick as possible part of the Western liberal community? And maybe three keywords from my perspective. Number one, we said it needs institutions. Secondly, infrastructure is very important, not only bridge but also digital infrastructure. And first and foremost, it needs a strong belief that there's a path to the European Union. I think that is very important. We have some examples in Europe where this path was very vague and which leads to massive disappointment. Two sentences how we do it. A, we should be very honest and coordinated amongst the development banks because there's real efficiency in the effort, where the impact is the biggest. And secondly, where do we have opportunities to mobilize private capital? Because the money which will be needed to restore and develop the Ukraine is massive, and the more private capital we can mobilize, the better from my perspective.
Thank you. A huge role for the private sector and civil society. Absolutely. Mr. Secretary.
Two things come to mind. One is the regional variations in conditions, and this is one of the reasons that I think a subnational strategy is intriguing. Obviously, backed by strong national commitments like those that Germany and the U.S. and others have made. But in my first conversation with my counterpart, who I now speak to quite often, I was struck by the different ranges at which he was thinking. On one hand, talking about the reconstruction and the terms of reconstruction in the early weeks, very early into when these pieces of infrastructure were still being destroyed. And then talking about a medium-term urgency around supporting the industrial production and agricultural production and exports that will finance the war effort. And then the still more immediate issue during the month of March of how there were a lot of areas that he was in touch with that were still figuring out how to plow the snow. The most immediate thing on many mayors' minds any given day in the wintertime. And so understanding the different needs and the different capacities of different parts of the country is going to be very important. The second thing to pick up on this mention of private sector and civil society is that if I were a mayor and wearing that hat, if I were mayor again, the first thing you think of course, are your different areas of community capacity. We just saw a remarkable example here in Berlin at the train station, the Hauptbahnhof, where I saw the volunteers, many of whom had self-organized within hours, really challenging the state to even catch up to them in the means of greeting and equipping and ultimately routing those refugees who were arriving by the thousands at the station. And so recognizing not just as a voice that you ought to include because it's the right thing to do, but as an extremely important source of capacity, especially when some of your other capacities have been degraded. I think the engagement of community, civil society, and volunteers is one that was especially well adapted to a localized strategy for support.
Yeah, the valuable taxpayers' money, of course, is important to use it very efficiently. And I think in the very first step, as Stefan said, it's important to really send a strong signal, a strong path towards Europe. We are recreating a European Ukraine that goes together with the institutions and strong institutions at the end, backed by Europe, by the European Union, make sure that we use efficiently the money we spend there. And then I think it's not against the idea of having the adoption of regions. I think that goes all together. But the European path, strong institutions, and the adoption is, I think, a good plan with where the Parliament can also, of course, support.
Yeah, it's understandable that there's enormous distrust because of the endemic corruption. But I think some of the things the Ukrainian government are doing, a lot of e-governance, procurement on platforms, that transparency. My understanding is the government is bringing in Deloitte to do auditing. That sometimes helps give that reinforcement. But it's something, of course, on our minds. And I think that bottom-up approach also helps provide that transparency. Okay, I want to take another step outside the circle. I want to talk a little bit about the transatlantic relationship. And obviously, transatlantic relations have never been stronger. But the list of things that the transatlantic relationship is working on has never been longer. So a lot of work to do. And I'm thinking in particular, the meetings that have been held recently over the last two or 3 days near Paris, the Trade and Technology Council, the EU-US Trade and Technology Council, and thinking about how the transatlantic relationship can really overcome a lot of challenges that it's had in trade and regulation and privacy, a lot of different issues, and how we can be stronger together. So I'm going to work my way the opposite way, starting with you, Thomas. Gives you time to think. I know I'm trying to reverse so you guys have some time to formulate. So what do you think is the most promising transatlantic opportunity that we haven't seized yet? Is it in technology, climate, trade? If you were giving a wish list to President Biden, to Chancellor Scholz, you know what, the transatlantic relationship really needs to work hard on these subjects, what would your list be?
It's probably all together. Because, I mean, it's really a pity that we don't have a trade agreement with our strongest and closest partner. So this is really something we missed in the past. We now see, and we saw the necessity years after TTIP was not working, but we should really take the chance and start from not from zero, but start from what we have done in the TTC and let us just do such an agreement, maybe in several steps, but let's make sure that we go forward in that way.
That sounds good. I know this is a little hard as a member of a government cabinet, but if you grabbed President Biden as you're walking out of a cabinet meeting, what would you say?
Well, look, I think first of all, as you know, we have a passionately pro-partnership administration, and that comes straight from the top. A president who believes in the transatlantic relationship, who believes in the power of partnerships and alliances, and we have seen new relevance to that thrust upon us by current events. I think we also are building on a very strong foundation, not just in terms of mutual cooperation and good feeling, but in terms of trade and in terms of foreign direct investment. As a child of the industrial Midwest, I know how significant the investment from countries like Germany in our manufacturing industry, for example, has been. And I think we are in a season that calls us to think about the relationships between our economic interactions and our values. In a way that's been thrown into very stark relief. And that's going to be important for navigating any number of challenges, from the current set of struggles between democratic and autocratic models to what will sooner or later somehow have to become a shared human struggle with climate change. And aligning our relationships around those long-term goals is going to be vitally important for any kind of progress.
Absolutely. And I think climate is a really huge area of opportunity for the transatlantic relationship. Stefan, what would your focus priority list for must-dos for the transatlantic relationship be?
Firstly, I would never give any advice to the US president. And secondly, I think our headline does set the tone for the future. I think it's now the moment where we need to have a renewed partnership between the US and Europe. And what does that mean? I think we need to be very, very honest about where we agree and where we disagree, which hopefully leads to a transatlantic partnership. But Europe has to do its homework. The analysis of autocrats in the world, really bad people is not incorrect. We are at a very fragile, we are fragile constitutionally in our sense of partnership, and this is really a warning signal and a wake-up call for us to go deep in the analysis, draw the right consequences, and then again execute. Part of the execution is the strengthening of the NATO and a trade agreement, but it's a call for action now, not tomorrow, now.
Please.
Just to add, I did like very much the history versus memory. And I think beyond all these economic questions, I think it's important to not lose the bonds between the people. And we don't have hundreds of thousands of soldiers getting to know Europe and Germany anymore. We don't have the relations between the families because the migration waves are now in the third generation and maybe the connections were loosened a little bit. So it's really an active task all the time for all of us to keep up the bonds between the people, and we need to make sure that we don't lose that. That's the foundation of everything.
Well, you're giving GMF extremely helpful advice. Thank you very much. But to your last point on the next generation, I mean, that, and I have to second Thomas. Secretary, your phrase, I'm going to steal it, the hinge point between history and memory. And that memory fades if you don't have that deep, deep interaction. Your experience in Champaign, Illinois was very foundational to how you think about things and your own relationship with the United States. When an American student comes here for an exchange, and we have wonderful trainees and interns at GMF, that's part of that experience. So I think that is a very, very important point. So I'm going to save the hardest question for last. I want to focus on, again, something that was very much part of the legacy of the Marshall Plan and the German Marshall Fund was strengthening U.S.-German cooperation, very specifically, not transatlantic and European. And certainly looking at the German-American relationship, you can probably describe it as a roller coaster ride. Some ups and downs. On occasion, we've had a loop-de-loop. I think we're coming out of the loop-de-loop, as I would say, on a roller coaster. So how would you characterize the German-American relationship now? And then this is the tough part. Looking into a crystal ball, what will this relationship look like in 3 to 5 years? 3 to 5 years, what are the issues that you think will profoundly shape the U.S.-German relationship in 3 to 5 years? Stefan, no time to think. I'm going to turn it right to you. Thomas is going to benefit from the think time.
I didn't know the answer before.
Okay.
And I know now, I need to buy some time. I know now why, Mr. Secretary Pete, you are sitting in the middle, because you never start with him.
I've got to protect the cabinet member. I'm sorry.
That's the diplomatic trick I just learned. But kidding aside, I think the relationship has never been stronger due to this historic event. Also, I feel it with citizen, with executive among corporates. There is a strong desire to make this work and remember our legacy and renew this as a partnership. In 3 to 4 years now, regardless who will run Germany or the US, I would say the moment of truth will be China.
Can you just elaborate on that point for one quick second?
I don't want to elaborate too much on it, but this is such a complex situation from an economic, social, geopolitical situation in a region where Germany has only economic interest. We have no legacy in that region whatsoever, and the US situation is fundamentally different. And as such, we will, I hope, renew our relationship with Japan in that region. It's very, very complex, and I think that should be a priority. If there's one priority outside Europe, I would say we need to have a common view on China, and currently probably we are not at the same point, to put it diplomatically.
China will shape the relationship, Mr. Secretary.
I don't disagree about that, and how important it is. I think, more broadly, even looking into the near future has become a challenge, sometimes more challenging, actually, than looking into the distant future, right? You look at the things that we're up against, some of which 3 or 4 years ago would not come as a huge surprise. Information fragmentation, which I chose to focus on in my remarks, climate change, which bears special mention because actually the only thing in our history or in our memory that is even close to the scale of cooperation that will be required to contend with the climate challenge is things like the reconstruction of Europe. So things like climate, things like information, digital issues, automation, we saw those coming. 3 years ago, we would not have imagined, obviously, the effect that the pandemic would have or the consequences of Russia's aggression against Ukraine. And so rather than even attempting to guess which of the challenges will be most pressing in that moment, what we know is that the challenges evolve and they shape shift. So the values and the commitments must not. That's the most important thing.
Fantastic. Thomas?
A lot has been said already, so I can at least tell what we're not discussing and what the challenges won't be. I think the burden sharing discussion will be gone. There is no discussion about Nord Stream 2 anymore, hopefully. So I think there were a lot of the big challenges taken out of the way, so we can concentrate really on China, climate change, but also our competitiveness of the transatlantic area and the Western world or the club of democracies against the autocracies and against China is the main rival, systemic rival. So that will be definitely the focus, and I hope we will be very aligned on that.
Well, I think it's important to acknowledge we've knocked off some pretty big irritants to the bilateral relationship and those important issues. Well, I have to tell you how I look at GMF at 50. It's the new 25. That's my story. But it speaks to how vibrant and important our work is. And you have given us a wonderful to-do list of action items, of focus. I think George Marshall would have been very proud of this discussion. Number one, he would have loved the infrastructure. A general understands logistics, and he would have very much appreciated, Secretary Buttigieg, your comments there. But I think he would have foot-stomped the values, that at the end of the day, that's what is essential, and that's what the Marshall Plan legacy was ensuring. Those values had a chance to go and to grow. So we are extremely, extremely grateful. So with your warm applause, would you please thank Stefan Wintels, Secretary Buttigieg, and Thomas Erder for a fantastic conversation.